Urbanization in China. We have with us four wonderful speakers. Mark Frazier from the New School, and I'll introduce each of them as they start speaking. Juan Du from Hong Kong University, Marianne O'Donnell from Shenzhen 302, and the author of the famous Shenzhen Noted blogs, and Solly Benjamin from the Institute of Technology at Madras in Chennai. The way we will do this is basically have the four of them speak. We have about an hour and a half with us. Mark Frazier would go first, followed by Juan Du, and then Marianne O'Donnell, and then Solly Benjamin, and then we'll sort of have a brief one question each that if the panelists want to ask each other, and then open up to the audience for questions. That's the program as of now, and I hope all of you will stay engaged through the evening. I know Mark is up early. Both Juan Du and Marianne will be staying up late. And we're extremely grateful that they have made these adjustments to their daily schedule to be with us in India at a time that we can engage with them. So thank you very much for that. To begin with, Mark, may I ask you to kick off the proceedings? Mark is currently at the New School in New York, where he is a professor of politics and the co-director of the India-China Institute. Last year, he published The Power of Place, which is contentious politics in 20th century Shanghai and Bombay, from the Cambridge University Press, which brings together issues of labor politics in the two cities, which is interesting for the kind of similarities that you possibly wouldn't expect going into that discussion to begin with. And Mark will be bringing in, starting this proceeding by offering a comparative perspective of urbanization studies in India and China, followed by Juan Du and Marianne O'Donnell. I'll introduce them as in just before they start speaking. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Thanks. Thanks, Partha, and thanks, Solly, and thanks to the organizers of the All India China Studies Conference. I was very fortunate to attend this conference in person some years ago when it was held in Benares, I believe 2014, Benares Hindu University. And it was a wonderful set of engagements with PhD students and others, faculty who are working on China. And it's really, I think quite rewarding to see, from this American how China studies is approached, in different parts of the world. And what I'm going to be talking today about is what could be considered an emerging field of what I'll call China-India urban studies. You'll hear me refer to it in this short presentation as CIUS, China-India Urban Studies. And it's really, I think this is something that's, at least in my thinking about it, is really quite inspired by many conversations that I've had over the years, particularly at workshops that were held in Shenzhen and Delhi in 2017, 2018, maybe both in 2018. Conversations with Partha, with Mukta Naik, with Juan Du and Marianne, and many others at these workshops where we were, all trying to, talk about sites and cities that we had conducted research in and knew best, and wondering if there are comparisons that can be made. How would they be made? Are there connections? In other words, flows of people and ideas and ideologies, even capital, of course, across these sites. And so I'm working on an article currently in which I'm in part looking at several recent publications from either articles or books that are explicitly comparing India and China. So Fulong Wu has several articles that he's published on this topic, looking at concepts that might be applied or not applied in the two cases. Xuefei Ren, who has published a book last year in 2020 on governing the urban in India and China. Selina He, a work on public provision, public service provision in cities of India and China. The book Partha just mentioned, my work on popular protest in Shanghai and Bombay across the 20th century. And so if there is if there is a field that we can call a field, an emerging field of China-India urban studies, what's distinctive about it? What does it contribute to the broader field of global urban studies or urban studies generally? And since this is a conference on China studies, it would be interesting to wonder how, thinking with urban India can help us understand urban China. Okay, so the biggest challenge in, I think, CIUS are, what are the objects and aims of the comparison, and what styles of comparison and what scales of comparison we should be paying attention to. So in the remainder of my remarks here, I'll be making just basically 4 points. And the first of which is that there is, among many of these recent publications, a tendency to explain some obvious variation in things like urban infrastructure or public service provision. Selina He's book that I just mentioned, titled Thirsty Cities, does this, looking at, as you might guess from the title, water provision. Another approach is to compare different institutions, political or otherwise, in China and India, that it can explain different patterns of conflict over land disputes, let's say, or environmental disputes. And this is what Xuefei Ren does in her book that I also mentioned, Governing the Urban in China and India. And in both of these works, the kind of strategy or the move is to take a set of cities in each country and then apply or induce some kind of national level generalization about them. So this, in this article that I'm working on, is in some ways reflective of an issue that others have called methodological nationalism in comparison, where the real object of comparison is the Chinese city with the Indian city. In other words, the heterogeneity or diversity within urban India or within urban China is sort of put aside, and we're looking at and trying to see what the real contrasts are and explaining those contrasts across the cases, usually relying, and as I also make this point in the article, in this field, and maybe for a variety of reasons, there's still a heavy reliance on, a handful, 3 or 4 of the largest Indian cities and 3 or 4 of the largest Chinese cities. Okay, second point is that, this kind of variation-seeking comparison that I've just referred to is very common in most social sciences. But what I hope that this field of CIUS can do is to adopt and refine some other less common forms of comparisons that are sensitive to transnational flows and connections that are common, right, across just about any city, but especially the cities that are being most commonly researched in China and India, the Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, Guangzhou, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, in Chennai in India. So I'm thinking here of what is sometimes called an encompassing comparison. An encompassing comparison where the units, cities, are situated in a global or regional kind of hierarchy and are connected by flows of people, ideas, investment capital, of course. And the comparative exercise is not so much to look at how they vary based on some supposed factor or variable, but to look at how some global current plays out in similar and different ways across those cities. So one obvious example of an encompassing comparison is how 2 cities responded to the global pandemic, COVID-19. Another common example in urban studies, of course, is how neoliberal development as an ideology, as a practice, and in planning infuses as a different in different ways across different cities. In Power of Place, the book I published in 2019, I did a kind of intertemporal encompassing comparison. Popular protest in the two cities during three periods: early 20th century nationalism, mid 20th century socialist modernism, and then late 20th century neoliberalism. Okay, so that's encompassing comparisons. The third point I want to make is to point out another potentially rewarding strategy of comparison in CIUS is to, and this would go for any, I think, kind of comparative exercises, abandoning or avoiding the pursuit of some kind of law-like regularities, some kind of universal hypothesis that is being tested, but instead look for understandings and interpretations of urban processes. And of course, this gets us into the explanatory framework and approach of the social sciences versus the interpretive approach. Understanding how people in whatever site we're looking at in the urban, how they understand the world, how they understand and do certain concepts that they might not use the word neoliberal in their vocabulary, in their everyday interactions, but we're looking at how they interpret what we call neoliberal development. So an example I could point to, Partha and his colleagues' work on subaltern urbanization, small towns in urban peripheries of large metropolitan areas, a process that is also occurring in urban peripheries in China. And the point is to compare urban processes and rather than looking for specific outcomes. So looking, informal housing, eviction and relocation, claims and contestations over urban citizenship, even if, even if that word is not being used by the participants, but they're making some claim to public space or some kind of claim to the city. Public health administration responses to COVID lockdowns and various contestations over that, also a promising area of a kind of interpretive approach to comparison. Okay, and fourth and finally, I think an extremely rewarding contribution in this emerging field of CIUS would be to consider the urban in the context of global China and indeed global India, looking at the presence of companies, officials, migrant workers, all over these various infrastructure projects and trading networks in Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. This phenomenon challenges us to rethink the application of, again, the national or methodological nationalism to urbanisms. So that when one uses a term like, if you take an example of a city in Tanzania that has lots and lots of Chinese investment, lots and lots of technology, provided by Chinese and Indian companies. Is that a Tanzanian city? Is it a Chinese city? It has large numbers of Chinese migrant workers, perhaps, and Indian migrant workers. So we're denationalizing the city, but still looking at it in terms of its attachments to connections with flows from China and India as global actors. Okay, so the bottom line is that CIUS has its greatest potential, I think, not in explaining many forms of variation and outcomes across urban India and China, because there's just so many different factors that one could point to, especially if you scale at the national level. But the greatest potential could lie in generating new concepts from common or similar urban processes. I did mention occupancy urbanism, but that wonderful article of Salih's from some years ago, this is, I think, also a rewarding example of how you produce a concept from close observations of things on the ground. And finally, just to say that the stakes in all this, why does this field matter if it emerges, if it doesn't emerge? I think the stakes should be pretty obvious. We got half the world's urban population will be living in cities within the territorial boundaries of China and India by 2050, and millions of others, as I just suggested, living the spaces of global India, global China. And how these cities fare in terms of their provision of public services, in terms of their endowments of substantive citizenship to the people who live there, will all go a long way in shaping, the political, economic, social, and even ecological future of the world. And thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation on this panel.
Thank you, Mark, for that framing and for reminding us that it's difficult to compare China and India as two static objects, especially Chinese cities and Indian cities. The fact that one looks at processes of transformation, and it is to that process of transformation that I think this session is dedicated, because in some senses there is an impression within the popular discourse that the Chinese urbanization is some kind of top-down, planned, structured process, whereas the Indian urbanization process is some kind of messy, noisy, chaotic phenomenon. That's while the messiness in terms of treatment of solid waste management is definitely something that is possibly visible in our two countries. It's conceptually, I think there's a lot of interest that sort of is happening. I think I'd rather keep the video off because it sort of keeps flickering back and forth. But and it is to that our next two speakers will address, and both of them will speak, I believe, to the city of Shenzhen, which in some sense is the iconic city of modern China, a city which didn't exist at the time when Deng started his reforms, and now sort of is the dominant symbol of modern China, from where the high-tech companies show up, from which engages most globally, which is right across the strait from Hong Kong, where Juan is based. So the next speaker, who is also the next speaker, and who will therefore be speaking from her book, which is The Shenzhen Experiment, which was published by Harvard University Press a couple of years ago. She is currently the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Architecture at Hong Kong University. But I understand that she soon will be in the summer, with various structures permitting, the Dean and Professor at the Daniel School of Architecture, Landscape Architecture and Design at the University of Toronto. Juan has, I think I first met her at a conference in Bombay many years ago. And we have since had many conversations that Mark has mentioned on Indian and Chinese cities, and especially on the manner in which the city of Shenzhen was actually formed. And so it's, therefore I turn now to her to take us through that particular process and talk about what led to that transformative process as one instance of Chinese urbanization in play. And an instance of urbanization that is both a mix of the top-down structures as well as the organic bottom-up story that I think we'll get to hear. So Juan, the screen's all yours.
Thank you, Partha. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks everyone for inviting me to this a very important conference. I feel like an old friend with people here and also with India. I first met Sally, I don't remember how many years ago, but it was in Amsterdam, right? At a China-Indian conference. Right. And I think I was one of two scholars from China. And it was the first time I met all of you. And I just remember waking up, going to breakfast, and I thought I was walking into a fight because 10 people sitting around the breakfast table, passionately debating about urbanization and the social injustice of the city. I was like, wow, it's only 7 a.m. It would be a very interesting day. So that, I mean, that was my first introduction. I think maybe that was 15 years ago. It was a long time ago. Yeah. To the very, very vibrant and lively and intellectual nature debate of urbanism by Indian scholars, and specifically on issues of urbanization in China and urbanization in India. So I'm very, very happy to be part of this particular conference. And I look forward to some of the discussions in the end. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share screen. Let's hope this can work. So let me know if you can see the title of my talk. Yeah? Yes. Okay, so thanks. I'm happy to be following Mark's presentation, which really creates a nice framework in which I can contextualize my work. And this discussion of, I think one of there were many motivations on why I wrote this book, even though I'm an architect, and it was incredibly difficult for me. It took me 15 years to get this book out. And one of the reasons, broadly speaking, was that because I grew up in the US, I taught and lived in the US, but I also know China very well, is I was very alarmed and frankly intellectually bored by the way in which the Chinese city was and is and still being discussed internationally, as if there's only one Chinese city and they're all the same. And that kind of the homogeneous treatment of both the city and also the treatment of that a city, you know, whether it's someone who lives in Beijing or lives in Shanghai or in Shenzhen, also a homogeneous population. So this is, you know, in some ways, something that I've tried to address was what I'm trying to do. And more specifically on the city of Shenzhen, it has, you know, the title of my talk is called Demystifying China's Instant City, because you know, what Partha was saying, is also one of the myths I was trying to overcome, was that somehow there is this idea that the Chinese city is this top-down, instantaneous, orderly, planned city, and that a city like Shenzhen, which Partha contributed to the myth, saying it didn't exist during Deng's time, and I would argue it did exist. In fact, that it have existed, a city, a urban, urban settlement has existed at the site for over a millennium, so that it is not instant, in fact. So before I get into some of the argument or the foundation argument of the book, I want to show a quick video. This is a clip of a longer video made by Russian television. Can you hear the sound? Shenzhen, city of the future. Got it. So again, Russian television, although not the source of intellectual trustworthiness by no means, what they're saying is what everyone has been saying, both in China, outside of China, in India, and everyone around the world, is that there was nothing there. It was just a fishing village, and boom, like that, it became the ancient city. So in some ways, my book called The Shenzhen Experiment, The Story of China's Ancient City, in some ways it's an ironic title because I don't think Shenzhen is an ancient city. And I try to, because I'm an architect and very much tell stories visually, the inside cover of the book is this Qing Dynasty painting, which I will come back a little bit later. So I assume everyone on this panel, including all the PhD students and researchers listening, are China experts. So I won't contextualize too much, but anyways, this is the Pearl River Delta. It's important because it has a population of 120 million. Oh, I changed that already. It's about 1.8 trillion US dollars today. That's 10% of China's GDP. So this one small spot. And this is the image of Shenzhen. But what I would like to point out is that while this is true, so I'm not here to say Shenzhen is not this, but I want to say Shenzhen is also this. And that if we didn't have this type of this is one of the largest urban village, it's an informal settlement. If we didn't have this, and we then wouldn't have this, we wouldn't have places of affordable housing for migrant workers who are the majority of the population in Shenzhen. We wouldn't have these lively street markets. And therefore, I felt it was part of the reason of trying to put the book together. And I try to put this in the introduction of the book, is that I really want to clarify 4 misconceptions of Shenzhen. And that is misconceptions of purpose, misconceptions of time, misconception of people, and misconception of place. And for the misconception of purpose is that because of the symbolism, the political, economic symbolism, a special economic zone for China, and I know part of the reason why I wanted to put this subtitle, special economic zone, here is I know the debate around the special economic zones in India is also raging, right? What is it about? Is it really working? What's the cost? And I want to, one of the things that I have found through my research, and I try to delineate, is that that first of all, that the special economic zone Shenzhen, it was the first special economic zone China. It was definitely enabled by Deng. Without him, it wouldn't have been possible. But neither the idea nor the implication came from Beijing. It was very much actually a bottom-up proposal from local leaders and local businessmen and local governance that they proposed this idea. It was accepted by the central government, supported by Deng. But the implementation of exactly how that from this abstract idea of a special economic zone to a city was very much something that was created in Shenzhen via this particular specific region. It was allowed by Beijing and Central, but it was by no means completely dictated or planned by neither Deng or Central. And the reason why this is related to purpose is that there is this assumption that the special economic zone of Shenzhen, or the special economic zone period, was created in order to, it was very successful because it turned China into this very wealthy city, one of the most wealthy in the world. And so therefore there is this, somehow the purpose of special economic zone is to generate profit and create wealth and making an economic, global economic powerhouse, right? That is the image of what it is. But I would argue the purpose of the special economic zone of Shenzhen, the reason why it was created, it was very, very complex, and was by no means to make China into a world economy. It was simply for China to get out of deep poverty. And I believe there is a difference of a purpose of difference being saying, we're making this so that we can be the world's most wealthy nation, versus we need to do this because our people are suffering and starving, and we need to modernize the country. We need to utilize a particular sites to test policies in which that will allow us to get out of devastating poverty and hunger. And that purpose, I think very often has been forgotten. And I do believe both conceptually and practically, it's very important, and especially important for all the countries, including India, who's looking to China, looking at special economic zones, and want to somehow not necessarily duplicate or replicate, but definitely trying to learn from it. And I do believe that this is a really important misconception that I would like to help to clarify. So the reason why Shenzhen, one of the major reasons why Shenzhen was chosen was because it was bordering Hong Kong. So this image is the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border crossing of Luohu. It's photographed from the 1960s. And one of the reasons why Shenzhen was chosen is that there were so many people escaping China illegally by swimming across the Shenzhen River, illegally crossing the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong at the risk of being shot to escape starvation. So, one of the reasons why this site was chosen and the special economic zone was created, that it was a buffer zone to try to make it, to try to experiment with different policies that wasn't anywhere else in China, so that that one can start to find a solution and to start to understand that you cannot stop people from escaping the country through a military border, but you have to be strong yourself, and in order to retain the people. And again, I think this is, for me, one of the most important misconceptions that I don't think that has been very much discussed in, at least in kind of the urbanization China specific discussions. Misconceptions of time. I'm speaking of time. I'm going to try to show the next few, I would say, misconceptions very quickly, because I think that purpose one is the most important for this discussion that we have. But I do want to outline quickly misconception time. Everyone assumes Shenzhen was created in 1979. That is true. The city of Shenzhen was established in 1979. However, there has been urban settlements and urban centers in the land that became designated to be Shenzhen for centuries. For example, this is, it was called Xi'an, one of the earliest fort cities. And it's right here, that's located on the western coast of Shenzhen, and this is what it is today. So it's still there, but actually the earliest settlement was established, according to historical records, at 100 BC. It was the first kind of military and governance post of the at the time of the Han Dynasty. It became a walled city around the 1500s. And it became more and more urbanized during the Ming and later Qing dynasty. This is what it was like during 1980, when Shenzhen, the city, was created. So you can see it was very much a very already settled fort city. And this is kind of, to a certain extent, how it remained today. And you can tell by, this is kind of area photo, you can tell the old street pattern of the historic streets still hold, and that you cannot drive in there because these are historic streets where it was only horse carriages that could go through, and obviously pedestrians. And there's still, even though the city wall was demolished almost 100 years ago, there's still remnants. You can still see there are remnants of kind of how the imprint of that ancient city wall. And these are images of this particular, it's called Nantou Historic City Urban Village today. So ironically, this kind of capital city that was really the capital of this whole entire region today is an urban village. It went from a city to a village, which is usually the reverse process. Misconceptions of people. There is this misconception that the people who lived in Shenzhen when it became a city in 1979 didn't matter. And certainly if we look at economic data, so the population in 1979 was in fact 300,000, not 30,000, and the GDP was 0.002 billion. And if we fast forward to 25 years later, 2005, the population was 12 million. So if you look at this, you say, okay, 300,000 to 12 million, yeah, that original number really doesn't matter. It is almost nothing, especially if you compare that to the GDP of what it later became. And I would argue strongly against this, because this 300,000 population that was in this area in 1979 were in fact distributed amongst various historic villages that has been in this region. This is a map of Shenzhen, Hong Kong. They've been in this region for centuries. And when it became a city, the city of Shenzhen from a rural Bao'an County, the population of these 300,000 were distributed amongst over 2,000 villages. And each village had their own production teams. Each village had their social organizations. Each village had their cultural memory. And each village had relationships, transnational relationships to people in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Canada, in Africa. It was very much a very instrumental group of population that enabled the urbanization, both the speed and the rate and the scope of urbanization of Shenzhen. So this is a historic map, obviously, of all of the historic villages. So to prove that point, this is a GIS mapping of the urbanization of Shenzhen. And, you know, there's a few kind of transformation of land designation between urban and rural, which I would not labor on right now. But if you look at the yellow spots inside the formal SEZ and later the yellow spot outside of the SEZ, those yellow spots are the so-called urban villages today. You could see the city pattern, the spatial urbanization pattern is exactly following where those historic villages that were there for centuries. So this is not a case of, you know, cities surrounding villages. This is very much that the urban fabric really grew out of the previous village fabric. And this is a testament to the importance, both kind of spatially, economically, and in terms of population, of the discounted so-called nothingness or a singular fishing village, which I think it is an unfortunate misconception because it negates the previous population and the previous history. All right, so this is the map where you see that all of the places that's marked yellow are the urban villages today, previously former historic villages, and you can see that urbanization pattern of the city, the de facto formal planned city, follows that pattern. This is one example, which I hope Marianne will speak about. This is by Shizhou Village. Last one, misconception of place. So, you know, I go back to this video of Russian television, so just 50 years ago, it was nothing but a tiny fishing village, which I hopefully already demystified. It was not one fishing village. It was 2,000 villages plus several major urban townships that have been there for centuries and very much active. And that is important not only in abstract terms of people and patterns. I want to explain, you know, even the urban planners who created the first master plan of Shenzhen, this is the master plan of Shenzhen in 1982, the orange spots is where they designated as living areas, and the brown spots are the industrial sites. So in special economic zone, the first thing you do is you designate industrial sites and you create factories. So what this did is that it actually carefully avoided all of the existing villages at the time. So it basically, from the very first spatial master plan of Shenzhen, it was very careful to avoid, by necessity, because the government of China and the new government Shenzhen at the time did not have money to buy land to buy all the lands from all the villages and to relocate all of them and to build housing for all of them. So it very much was not intentional. It was not intentional they would leave the historic village where it is. It was one that came out of necessity and financial constraint. But so what that means is that you will have even from the first master plan, you had a spatial distribution and a spatial organization that was built. The city grew around the villages. So for example, this is Cai Wu. This is one of the largest urban village in Shenzhen, and this is a photograph taken in 1985. You can see skyscrapers starting up, highways being built, and you can see the city was kind of, the high rises and roads and railway stations was kind of carefully avoiding the previous village settlement. Fast forward 30 years, this is Cai Wu. This is about 10 years ago when a large parcel of the urban village of Cai Wu was being demolished. And it was demolished during its process of demolition. It created, it's called China's strongest nail house. So if anyone's interested in his or her story, you can just Google that. But what I want to show is that this area was cleared. And eventually, the nail house was also demolished in order to create this St. Regis 5-star hotel designed by Sir Terry Farrell of London to be the symbol, the image of the city. However, if you pay attention to this here, I hope you can see my cursor, still large parts of the original Cai Wu urban village still remains. It hasn't been completely demolished yet. So this is my concluding slide. It's just to say that in the introduction chapter of my book, I just try to lay out that essentially why it's important for us to look at Shenzhen and why it is important for us to understand the nuances and the differences and what Mark was calling kind of the stories and conflicts, rather than always concluding or deducing, here's what to do. I also absolutely agree. It's first we need to understand all of the things that all of the stories and all of the narratives that happen. So the book is organized in 8 chapters, each 4 sections, from national relevance to regional history to city construction to district transformation. It's in terms of scale from national to a neighborhood. And each of the chapter centers around a cast of people, characters, although they're not fictional characters, they're real people. And some of them are original villagers, some of them are migrants, some of them are political leaders, and some of them are developers who were a migrant worker, who was a migrant worker when they arrived in Shenzhen, and today is one of the most successful developers in the world. So I very much have tried to interweave the personal narratives and stories of individuals and kind of the overall transformation of the city. And part of the argument that in my conclusion, calling a city of critical experimentation, and this is why I use the title of the Shenzhen experiment, is that it was not only an experiment of, say, economic reforms, which is what often is being said, but I believe it's important that it was a city of critical experimentation, because the experimentation and experiments that took place in Shenzhen was everything that the rest of the country at the time was not. In fact, it was the opposite of how the rest of the country were governed and operated, both kind of economically, but also social politically. So the critical nature of the city of Shenzhen and the critical importance of those experimentations and the reforms, which I would argue was not only economic reforms, it was also social political reforms. I believe we still have a lot to learn, including myself, to really try to understand this particular city and what it can teach us about this critical experimentation. And there are still so much we can learn of this unprecedented human experiment, because it is a city that went from 300,000 to over 12 million in 20 years. That has never happened in the world before. So we're still, I think all of us are still student of the city, still trying to understand it. And I hope that it can be a source of a knowledge and study and critique for perhaps centuries to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. And that's a lovely segue into Marianne's work, whose book, which came out a couple of years ago, is actually called Learning from Shenzhen, with Winnie Wong and Jonathan Buck. And Marianne's cultural anthropologist who's actually lived through that transformation that Juan actually described for you. She has a PhD from Rice and is the founder of Handshake 302, and has been blogging about this transformation in Shenzhen for the last 16 years, I think, at Shenzhen Noted. So, and Marianne is therefore ideally placed to offer a very rich account of essentially the human processes that drove this broad urbanization trend that you see that Juan has outlined in broad brushstrokes. So, Marianne, yes, I can see that you are unmuted, and hopefully we can. Your cats are off your computer.
They didn't actually, it's not, I haven't managed to figure out what they did wrong. I apologize in advance. I'm going to try and share something from my screen, but I haven't been able to use the camera on my computer for about 2 weeks. I don't know what they did to the computer. And I apologize. I'd like to start by, I'm going to try and show a video. If it doesn't work, I sent one to Solly. And so he may be able to show this. I'm going to try to hit share screen. And hopefully y'all can see this. Can y'all see it?
Yes.
Yes.
在摆饰中，你无论站在哪里，旁边的人都可以撑到你的肩膀，踩到你的脚后跟。他们那个是很暖的一个温度。
很多人他爱艺术，喜欢艺术，希望跟艺术接近，但是他没有相应的背景，就好像他没有一种某种资格证来参与艺术一样。其实艺术不是这样的。
可能我从个人的角度来讲的话，艺术往往是给人带来开心的一面。
预期最后是什么样子我不知道，但是总有一半的这种把握。
Okay, that of a piece, I'm gonna try to come back. I don't know how to come back. I really don't understand Zoom. I apologize. If you can't hear me, please let me know. Of a piece was an early work that we did in order. What we did was, what we did with Of a Piece was we decided we wanted to create an artwork that reflected the way the city was built. And so one of the things about by Shuzhou about many and the way Shenzhen was built, and I think Juan said this, is it was built by hand, and it was built by many hands. And what most people also overlook is that one of the earliest industries in the city was textiles. And some of the earliest workers were hired to do textiles. And much of the success of fast fashion has been that textile work is outsourced to cottage. It's basically a cottage industry in Shenzhen. There are factories where things are put together, but many of the small pieces that go into making a complete piece are made in houses, or they're made in apartments of by women who are also taking care of children, who are also taking care of their families. And so what we did to make Of a Piece is we went into one of the fabric markets in downtown Luohu, and we bought as much as we could for 100 yuan. And then we set up in the Shenzhen Museum of Art a workstation, and the workstation was open from 9 to 5 for 2 weeks. And you could come in and you could make anything you want. And the only rule was you couldn't take apart somebody else's work. And so you could stitch up whatever you wanted to stitch up. And then when you left, you attached your piece to the rest of the work. And so the way we attracted people to come in is the Shenzhen Art Museum is located above a theme park. And the project took place during the summer when it was really hot. And we had air conditioning and we had cold water. And so we would go down into the theme park and we would tell people, if you come and stitch for us, we will give you cold water and air conditioning. And what happened was, within about 2 days, all of the grandmothers knew they could bring their kids in, and the kids would run around and the grandmothers would chat and do about 3 pieces of like 3 stitches. But they had cold water, air conditioning, and the kids were happy. And this is a very, this idea of something not being quite done, the fact that it's under construction, is very much a Shenzhen kind of thing. And this idea of videos, the idea that things are made by hand and that they're made opportunistically and that they're made through people trying to do different kinds of things using what they have at hand. And what they might have at hand could be ways of outsourcing, but very often it means trying to work with people who in various ways are are free to move about the country, but are not actually free to move about the city because they're taking care of children or they're tied to a job or something like that. And textiles is a really important site in which this happens. And so Handshake 302, one of the things that we did was we set up we set up a residency where people could come and live in the village and see what they were inspired to do. And we were hoping that people would see what we did, which was that everything is created collectively, it's created opportunistically, and it's created because you can figure out how to give people something they want in return for something you want. And so now what I'm going to show is, this is not where I want to be. I'm going to show you one of the a snippet from a piece of work that one of our residents did.
Marianne, you need to maximize your screen because right now we're getting to see your desktop and your file names with the Wandering Bicycle Road Creator on one side of the screen.
All right, so I have to get into.
I think we just click on that thing, that might work.
Right here?
Yeah.
How's that? Is this the full screen?
No. Maybe you just minimize your screen if, in case this is playing somewhere else.
I think it may be where you stop share and then share you go stop share and Zoom and then share the new object, the new video.
Okay, let me see.
Just a guess.
View, show edit window. Really, I truly apologize. I don't know what's happening. I don't know where I've gone. I'm going to skip directly to the next section because I can't figure out and I don't want to waste people's time showing off my ignorance. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, I'm just going to stay with that. So what I'm going to read is from the residency. One of Partha's colleagues, Persis Tara, Partha, help me with her last name.
Tarapurwala.
Yes, came and stayed in Baishajo for a month. And I'd like to read some of the poems that she wrote about this experience. The first poem is called Built. I am not shiny. I am not shiny and smooth. In my facade, there is no glass and steel. I am brown. I am bespotted. Come closer, and you can feel me. I am coarse, textured. I am coarse and textured and unable to reflect other buildings. When you pass me, you will not see a reflection of yourself, not even a distorted one where you can adjust your hair and walk on. When you pass by me, you will see me standing here in my brownness, my coarseness, my being, and maybe, just maybe, if our eyes meet, you will see the only part of me that shines. Typhoon. It's raining outside and the roads are flooded. People in boots are stomping in puddles like small children. I stand under the comfort of shade and look at the scene before me, at the space transformed by rain. It's magical. The noise of the shops and the consumerism that seeps into my everyday life is muffled by the sound of rain on trees and leaves. of puddles and rivulets formed, of people gazing at the skies and at the rain. I am not the only one, after all, enjoying the change. The streets are a clutter of umbrellas and plastic coverings, and in all this chaos, there seems to be a settling down of space that only water can create. I must remember, though, that while this is rain for me, it is a typhoon for someone else, magical here and devastating elsewhere. Somewhere I feel a pinch, a sense of unease seeps through. I know that the life I lead is alienated, both here and at home. I think back to the times I have danced with unseasonable rain on my terrace, feeling the cool breeze and fleeting respite from Delhi's heat, unfurling my hands to catch raindrops, twirling like a peacock, moving with only rhythm and elation driving me, laughing and smiling, and when I grow tired, brew some tea and look at the newly formed rivulets and cleaned leaves outside. My sigh is a sigh of relief. But elsewhere, where earth and hands grow the food I eat, there are no sighs of relief. In places where regularity of seasons are not a luxury but a requirement, there is no dancing and unfurling of hands. There is no looking at leaves and rivulets. There is no delight in the rain. The rain is seen in its honest form, detrimental to life and well-being. The skies in Baishuzhou look beautiful because of a typhoon that killed people. And I'm going to read, the final poem is to WeChat, because when Persis was here, WeChat was just starting to take off. Beloved WeChat, I must admit that until a few weeks back, I was ignorant and a fool, for I knew not of your existence. I knew not of your beauty. I knew not of the depth of your power and the strength of QR codes. I have since atoned. I see, I know, and I believe. I see the hundreds of hands multitasking. I know of the eyes that see all. I believe in the magic that is you and your form. You are the trinity of omnis, potent, sentient, and present. You are. But who am I, a lowly human, to define you? I who do not have even a binary code operating my system. How am I to understand you and the complexity of your algorithms? I only know that I see you and your messages everywhere, in the market, in offices, in posters, and even food. I see the artistic square of infinite design, each one unique. And as I have learned in the last 2 weeks, I need but you to survive. When I was ignorant, I thought, and I admonish myself for this belief, that texting, dating, sharing files, banking, traveling, and so much more had to be done through individual apps. Individual apps. How was I so naive? But now I know the truth, and in you, my Messiah, I believe. I really like Persis's poetry because I think it connects much of what we've been talking about with when Mark mentioned we need really more interesting kinds of comparisons, and hopefully the kinds of comparisons that alert us to the humanity that we share. And as Juan was saying, that really it's hands that built the city. And to think, one of the things that I find very remarkable about a lot of modern architecture is no matter how fancy the outside gets, much of the inside space is still pretty much high modernist, right? White walls, square spaces, lucky if you get a window, kind of dank when it's too humid. That my hope is that when we look at Shenzhen, when we look at cities in India, when we visit each other's homes, that we can bring it all together in a way that moves us and moves each other. And so hopefully the contribution of Handshake 302 is we try and create and curate projects that allow different kinds of people to experience and then to express those experiences of particular spaces that we love. So yeah, That's me. Thank you. And again, I do hope to figure out what I'm doing, because right now the only thing on my computer desk is Partha's face. That's all I can see. Yes, thank you.
Now you can't even see that. Thank you, Marianne. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about the city, some of which you already seen that string. But let me now finally move to Solly, who essentially will offer the outsider's perspective that comes from sporadic visits to the space that we have been discussing. As Solly will also, in some sense, be able to put some of this stuff together to then take this session, which is running a little bit over, to the Q&A session fairly rapidly. So, Solly.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you very much for these really in-depth presentations. I'm aware we are kind of running short of time, so I'm going to try to run you through some slides which actually connect up through all three of the presentation. I must promise you we didn't plan this, so it's kind of evolved, and you know, you'll see possibly some strong connections. So I'm going to try to see whether I can share my screen, and so let's see if it works. I hope you can all see the first slide. I'm trying to
if
make
you can just go full screen, Solly, it'll be fine.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that. Does this work?
Sure.
Can you see all this?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll sort of get straight into two kind of working spaces. One is a seemingly more academic one, but that binary will soon break down, hopefully, where an old friend and colleague, Wing-Shing Tang, who's at Hong Kong Baptist University. In fact, I first met Wing-Shing when I first met Zhongdu in this conference by the Sarai group at Amsterdam. So, but since then we kept in touch, and thanks to him, I could make many visits to Hong Kong and Shenzhen and mainland China. And what we're doing with Prasad Shetty and Rupali Gupte from, who are both architect, urbanists, and also installation artists, and we kind of bridge across, is we've been trying to look at this process of what Mark very usefully laid out, his number 3 part of the CIUS, where you start to look at particular sites, and Wing-Shing does so in Kowloon, a particular part of Kowloon, the boundary street, and Prasad, Rupali, and myself look at sites in Mumbai's western suburbs, and I do it in East Delhi, more industrial area. And what we've tried to do is try to think about how have these places been constituted through very complex processes, some of which are transnational, some of which, as you'll see in a couple of slides, involve stories of particular family and the way they engage with then court spaces, conflicts come up. And I think the common kind of understanding is trying to take these kind of materialities very seriously. One of the things, so we don't, what we've tried to do in these projects is not try to do the model 1 of what Mark laid out, but really try to look at something which puts together the way land starts becoming alive as a major sort of actor. Land we found useful because, again, like what Jean-Du was talking about, these are sites which have had older tenural forms which are still alive. And one interesting thing we found in a lot of contemporary historiography is that post-colonial realm, they tend to wipe out or assume a kind of a wiping out of earlier kind of land tenurial settlement practices, and assume that everything then becomes neoliberal, subject to a kind of planning. We find that that's actually that kind of eraser. And I think what Jongdu mentioned, it kind of discounted nothingness was a term which I just sort of wanted to highlight. Those kind of erasers kind of erase out a set of practices which we see in Marianne's work, how you put things together, and how whether it is document records, which then are fought out in various kind of court spaces, titles are constituted, various claims are made, as well as physical structures being built. The second part, and I'm going to not spend too much time, is, and it looks different, but we've started to look at various kind of China bazaars. So if some of you have smartphones which need to be fixed up, let me know. I'll locate an agent who's the ustad, the agent of an agent, and who will then get it fixed. Well, I'm partly joking and only partly serious. But the point is this, that these are groups of people working with electronics, working with their hands, and with capital machinery, which is again imported in small firms from China and some big firms too, who then start going to Shenzhen on a almost every 3 monthly basis. Now, if I had to do quote unquote China studies, as I'm sure most of the conference has been, learning the Chinese language or any other language would be very important. But for these people, learning the language is that of shared electronic spaces. When I talked to several of them, I said, do you use translators? They said, no, because in translators, then the business deal doesn't, you don't know whom to trust, who's paying whom. So in a sense, it's a very interesting kind of a set of what we are calling embedded economies, slightly but not totally borrowing from Polanyi, is to see how these spaces of technology get embedded in places where people learn on the job. And I'll just try to change the slide to the next one. You start getting these rich stories that come out of these sites. Now, I've just picked up two very fast representation because I'm hoping Partha will tell me how many minutes I have more. One is from a set of essays by Prasad Shetty, where he talks about Bombay Talkies, which was one of the oldest Bollywood sites, which sort of led to a whole set of transformations of land. So very much trying to trace out these kind of settings, as both Jongdu and Marianne kind of do in the case of Shenzhen, to break this kind of myth that suddenly you have a distinct colonial period and then you have a separate neoliberal period, this kind of a binary. And what we found is, and then in the Hong Kong case, what Wing-Shing has been looking at is the complexity of orders, because his particular site of the Boundary Street is a site where you have Chinese land tenures with both separate of topsoil and bottom soil forms start to overlay in the way contemporary Hong Kong or Kowloon kind of urban redevelopment starts to happen. I'm trying to give you a sense that is this kind of complexity, I think that's extremely important to be able to work with how spaces transform. The kind of meta-narratives that normally we see in the literature, I think those don't tell you too much, and they kind of do this kind of eraser, which I think is not just an issue about loss, but it actually replaces or emphasizes one sort of political realm where these kind of making by hands in a metaphoric way are kind of decommissioned. They are sort of lost out, reduced to a very narrow quote unquote heritage type of narrative, so that you can leave one building while you wipe out, the rest. And I think the point I make, and this is my final slide, of showing sounds like one of those Hollywood slasher movies where we've dismembered a whole lot of smartphones and trying to understand what do people who've not had the opportunity to get into IIT, and both of the people in the foreground are those. They're people who are working with these technologies, self-taught, but also through YouTube, and also something called schematics, Google schematics, where if you put in the specifications of your phone, you put in a question, how do I repair this sound card or something? Within minutes, I get a message from Indonesia. I use Google Translate, and I get ways to work the system, the electronic system. And I think this is the kind of, and you're talking of huge volumes, so it's not something small. And a colleague, Professor G. Venkatesh, who comes from the industry, he and I and many of these people whom you see on the screen are trying to kind of, in a sense, I think, which is, I think, really an important theme coming out in this session, to humanize these kind of transnational connections. This is not just big business. Of course, big business and corporate capital flows, but you're also having these kind of flows, because ultimately it's these kind of explorations in a very material way, which allow them to make connections with firms in Shenzhen. So you get these new end phones. So I think that I'm trying to kind of, emphasize that this kind of learning in these kind of very material spaces allow us to think about cities with new kind of concepts, and not those generally stuck in a very old modernism, which is then again gets locked into a kind of meta narrative. So I'll stop here now, and I'm wondering how to stop sharing the screen, just so that here we are. Stop share. Yeah, just to kind of give you a kind of a very quick entry into emphasizing I think the importance of all of your presentations, to develop new ways of new theory and new ways of thinking about cities in interconnected ways, rather than ways which actually box them into a kind of ghettoized, like this is India, this is China, or this is Japan. So thank you very much, Partha, and I wish we should have now more time for questions.
Thank you, Solly. And as you can see, Mark, the flows that you expected from global China and global India have sort of seem fairly represented in that slasher movie story that Solly seemed to sort of outline for you. Let me stick to my promise, since we have technically 9 minutes left on this session, but I will hopefully my panelists will indulge me as much as I've indulged them in sort of giving me a few more minutes to take it forward. So, let me begin by first asking the panelists whether they have any questions for each other, and then I'll move to the questions that are coming in on the chat box. And if anybody's posting questions on YouTube, I'm hoping that my ICS colleagues will alert me to that. Sure. So Mark, Juan, Marianne, any questions for
I have
each other?
I have a question for Sally.
Yes, go ahead, Marianne.
Sally, I mean, the slasher film, I mean, I love to think about neoliberalism in terms of vampire stuff, because it's all about desire out of control and satisfying that desire through blood, right? I mean, I love that metaphor. So slasher films is this kind of way of trying to understand how people are simultaneously using the system that they do not have a lot of access to, but they still need to have access to it, right? It's kind of like when you had marauders, right? Like when, so when you settled people, and they're growing they're basically either enslaved or forced into labor to grow crops. And then you've got people running around stealing the crop, and then the government shows up and wants the crop. But the marauding actually works because you have a fixed government, you have fixed limits in place, right? And so like slasher film is slashing the actual the phones. I mean, that's kind of what I do to my technology, but not intentionally. But I guess my question is, what movie would you use, what movie genre would you use to kind of describe what these people are up to? Like what kind of a narrative? I mean, are they vampires? Are they ghosts? Is it a romance, or are we looking at high melodrama, right? I mean, is it a boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love? And then, the American version is girl gets murdered, so boy realizes himself through figuring out who murdered her and then murders someone else, right? That's the American version of that story. And there, I mean, you can do, the whole world has a different take on how.
I obviously need to watch more films than I actually do. But
so anyway, Sally, what's I mean, are they slasher movies, people, or what's the movie? What are we watching? Like, where is the drama in these lives?
Yeah. I just want to, first of all, clarify, I use the slasher thing mainly to say that we were taking apart the phones. So it wasn't directly connected to the movies. But I think you raise an important point in a sense that if in several of these sort of Korean movies, which I just find fascinating, or even in some of the Nigerian movies where you play around with time and the technology of making the movie itself starts to open up new identities. And I think that's something like we have something called the Malegaon film production, where they use very simple technology to make these superhero type of characters. I think if you look at the phone thing, I mean, starting from the phone part, the way an economy is made where these people are able to move to Shenzhen every 3 months, they've got a kind of business thing going. One of the chairperson of our China Center, Ambassador Ranganathan, made a point that he said they have such large volumes of these small traders going to China that it's actually one of the things that affects normal, quote unquote, normalization of India-China relations in a below the radar way. Because these are not big, mining companies sending iron ore to China and therefore open up that political economy. You're talking of a kind of like in Yiwu, I went to Yiwu and I just found myself stunned that you're getting, five or six types of quote unquote South Asian vegetarian types of food because, different traders, and the group that had put me in, they thought, well, I wanted Iranian food, but they wanted me to have the Indian food. I'm trying to say that these kind of connections and the kind of stories that both you, in laying siege to the villages, and then in Jean-Dou's, historicization of this kind of cartography is essential to humanize it in the way things are getting put together. And I think the problem with urban studies and urban theory is still stuck in a Le Corbusian kind of model making, which has not, which erases, for example, say working with land. And this is not a romanticized working. Land politics is huge. I mean, a lot of Korean movies have that as, the center of violence, or the Hong Kong-based movies, Overheard 2, which is based in the New Territories, around the landform of the Ding, which then generates its own politics. I mean, I think sort of movies, novels, poetry have able to touch on a lot of concepts, which I think in the social sciences, we've kind of got stuck in. And I think that's, so I don't know, that's a kind of a very quick answer to your response, but I think this new kind of theory making, we have to take these other realms more seriously. And Yeah, it'll require a longer conversation, and you have set me thinking. But yeah, we'll have to work collaboratively, I think, on that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Solly. Let me pose a few questions that have come up to Mark and to Juan and Marianne and the other panelists too. First, to Mark, this is from Bhim Suba, talking about are dominant comparative studies done only on historically power-centrist sites than hinterland cities or urban centers? And are there any subnational perspectives on these comparative structures going forward? The first sort of structures that have moved through in some sense. It's contestable whether we should think of Shenzhen as something historically that's been a power center, but obviously now it has been. That's one of the major things in that particular space. Then the other question is on, and that's to Marianne and the other panelists. How do you see China's Greater Bay Area plan shaping the future of urban villages in Guangdong? And how have migrant workers been responding to these changes, especially in terms of shifting housing or shifting businesses, kind of structures going forward? Then there is an early question, following Juan's presentation, which was essentially on conflicts during the build-up of the new urban areas and movements within, and the kinds of rights that are enjoyed by the original residents of the village in that particular area. And I know it's a differentiated and complex process, and obviously the rights of the owners of those villages and the rights of the people who are living in them are substantially different in that place, and that's something that would be interesting to speak to, which also then I think ties up with the last question from Bhim, which is in terms of the people, how do you see them, natives, migrant workers, economic or political elites? And I think this sort of, in some sense, I think, Juan, links between your time and people as to how over time the people sort of transform from natives to migrants to now perhaps in some cases economic elites. So if you could maybe address them quickly, starting with you perhaps, Mark, and on the issue of subnational, and also on any other of the issues that you might want to respond to, especially let's say on the Greater Bay Area plan and so on. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thanks, Bhim. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for the question. I guess the way I would answer the question is yes, especially those who are, sociology, political scientists who are beginning to or have studied cities. There is this, strong and enduring tendency to do the kind of type 1 that I talked about in my presentation. But there are, I mean, what in hearing the Shenzhen case being discussed and the remarks by the other panelists is that, what occurs to me is that it's the sites of flows. I mean, this is a border case, right? A border. So studying border areas, whether they are connected to kind of networks of dense networks of flows, or if they are in a peripheral area and yet still a border that is farther away from, say, extensive capital flows. I think these can be very, very productive sites. I mean, in the case of China, and I recently wrote a review of a book about sort of urban policies and urban planning, and the author Kyle Yaros makes the argument that the provincial level governments, to be the state level governments in India, are the main players and power centers in terms of determining the extent to which investment, urbanization investment capital goes. And so some provinces in China will have a dispersed kind of balanced level of city building, and others will, like Hunan province, for example, will pour it all into, place all the bets on one urban center. And it's still a very, of course, it's not top down from Beijing, but it's top down from the province. But what I think is so rewarding potentially in this CIUS field, as the discussion of Shenzhen, as Sally's discussion shows, is that we're not trying to say that one place is replicable or it has lessons necessarily that you can just transport elsewhere, or that it's even representative. But this concept of adaptation, of experimentation, of letting the unplanned be the planned, be the plan, I think is really quite fascinating. And it shows that, and it's in that sense, if it's not replicable, it is at least gives us pause to think more deeply about what is urbanization and who are the main actors. But I think the people we're hearing, my colleagues on the panels are, I think, would probably be deemed, if you talk to an editorial board of some, especially mainstream social science journals, they would say, well, they're coming from an innovative, but yet not hegemonic, or certainly not a powerful kind of perspective. And it's these alternative perspectives, I think, that are so promising in a potential field of CIUS.
Thanks, Mark. John Doe, you want to take the question?
Sure. So the question,
people and how the structures have been put together.
So I'll try to see if I can tell a 1-minute story that is in chapter 6 of my book. The chapter is called Nail House on Wall Street, and it is following from the perspective of I tried really hard to shape the chapter following the perspective of a single person, and this gets to hopefully address Partha, what you were asking me to do, to talk about the transformation of people's identity in Shenzhen, and hopefully also through the story, I can address that question of, do the earlier inhabitants have any special rights, treatments, identity issues, which that's a really, really big question. It's very complex. There's been hundreds of papers written about it. But what I try to do is really trying to tell it from the perspective of impacted individuals. So Nail House on the Wall Street follows a story. In my presentation, I showed it, Tsai Wu-wei. It was 2 persons standing in front of the nail house. There was a woman and a man. And I tried as much as I can to tell the story from the woman, because too many, most, urban narratives is really focused on the male, especially coming out of the Chinese city. So she is a very, very interesting case. And this story will also tie into this question that was posed to Mark about, are there considerations to hinterland cities, or is it always these kind of powers of centers of power historically? Shenzhen was a hinterland. It was very rural. So during Mao's sundown movement of sending all of the educated youth from urban centers to hinterland, to villages, this woman, she was 16 years old, high school student, sent from Guangzhou city, powerful city, historic city, sent from the city to the countryside, to Bao'an County, which later became Shenzhen. 16-year-old, she was sent to this Tsai Wu-wei village. She would work there in a work unit in the village, marries a young villager. And before Shenzhen became Shenzhen, the young villager smuggled across the border. Goes back to what I was saying, that many people smuggled across the border to escape poverty, leaves the village, leaves Shenzhen, and she would not hear from him for 20 years. She stayed in the village, which was very difficult for her because she was an outsider, married to the villager that left, but she had 2 of his kids. So single mom, outside of the village, raising 2 kids, and boom, Shenzhen city was formed. So as a villager, when the city urbanized, the city government bought all of the farming lands from the village, but because they didn't have enough money to resettle the villagers, they left all of the villages what they call home-based land, kind of saying like, we can't build housing for you, but each of you could have your own land to build a house. And you own that land that the house is built on, and you own the house. So the special right of the earlier inhabitant was they had ownership in a city that had pockets of designated as rural land. So the analogy I use, maybe to American, is they became reservations, village reservations in a city. So the original villagers, inhabitants, had a right that no one else had coming to the city as a migrant, is they could own land, and one cannot own land in China in a city. So Shenzhen is very special. You have this city where little pockets of land was owned by the village collective, but one small piece of land, you can build a 2-story house, and that's yours. When the migrant workers started coming and everybody came in, and so we go back to her, Zhang Lianhao is the villager's name, the woman who married the villager. She, like everybody else, opened her house, rented every single bed space to migrant workers. When more and more people wanted to live there, all of the villagers demolished their 2-story village house and started building little mini towers for rental, mini towers 6 stories tall. So now all of the villagers, all of the earlier inhabitants became landlords who collected rents from all of the migrant workers. So 2 things happened is that they became much more wealthy than all of the migrants. They also became vilified because they became the greedy landlord. So yes, there are identity issues for sure. So, so they became so vilified by the majority of the population of Shenzhen, the migrant workers, as hungry landlords, that when, fast forward, if you want the full Hollywood story, read that chapter. Fast forward, the husband who left and wouldn't hear from for 20 years came back when he heard that Shenzhen was no longer a poor village and everybody was really wealthy. So he left Ecuador and met a wife and children, typical man, leave another woman, comes back to Shenzhen, moves with his original wife, and now they collectively are landlords. And when they refuse the settlement fund from the government and from the village to demolish their home, they became the snail house. I say that my point is they were so vilified is that when they stood up to the developers and the government giving them what they said was unfair compensation for their building and for their land, and they put it on social media and tried to get public support, where they got was not public support. What they got was social media attack and newspaper attack saying, essential sentiment, you have already gained so much undeservingly from this urbanization process. You've sucked the blood, vampire movie, Marianne. You sucked the blood out of all of us. Now you want more money. How horrible. So, so there, it's very much fraught. And my position on that is that these original villagers, yes, they became landlords, but they also individually funded building these rental housing to rent out to migrant workers. And if you didn't have these 300,000 individuals investing their money, mobilizing their transnational resources, building all of this, the city would not have urbanized so quickly and so successfully. I would just give you one statistic. Today, 2020, Today, there are between 200 to 300 urban villages in Shenzhen. Over 50% of the city's population. This is the city of the future, okay? This is the city of technology. This is the modern city of China. Over 50% of the future city of Shenzhen still lives in homes made by hand, as Marianne noted, I spoke about, made by hand, funded by blood of, these original villagers. 50% of the city today still live in these illegally built urban village housing. So, so it is a very, very complex situation. But yes, what I try to do with the book is that with every chapter in tackling these really complex situations, I really try to contextualize that and tell that from a story of a single individual. And in this case, in this chapter, I've really tried to tell her her story. So to summarize, to get back to Partha's issue raised about the transition of the identity of individual, Zhang Lianhao, this girl, urban girl sent to the village. So she was an urban to rural migrant. She became ruralized because her identity became a villager. And then she became urbanized because she became an urban villager. And then was the demolition of her now house and giving her money, but no longer owning the city, no longer having any ownership to the city or the buildings. What was also taken away from her was her identity and her place in the city and her right to the city. So in the end, she became a displaced migrant yet again. So, so in some ways, one talk about the complexity of the transformation of the city of Shenzhen, rural to urban, But if we start to look at the individual stories, it's far more complex and far more rich through that lens to look at the city and everything again. So yeah, that's my storytelling story. So maybe it went a little bit longer, but I was trying through this narration, try to kind of bring both, the personal, the theoretical, and these multiple questions and weave them a little bit together, even to that issue of, what's happening today. I've asked, the Great Bay, what's happening to the urban villagers? What's happening to the original villagers today? How does one respond? And it is, we're in between the stage of gentrification and displacement. But I do think because, 50% of the people still live in these urban villages, it's impossible for that to completely disappear, and it shouldn't disappear. And, if the government, if anyone has any intelligence, one would realize it would devastate the city, it would destroy the city by demolishing all of the villages. And in some ways, I would hope that that this could perhaps offer some insight in what's happening and what has happened to many of the villages and urbanizing villages and urban villages of India.
Thank you. Let me finish by asking Marianne to talk to a little bit of this particular phenomenon. And especially, I recall when I was there, the transformation of Gangxia, which was one other example of the kind of transformation that Juan just showed you. But also the recent transformation, I understand, of Baishizo, where Marianne's Handshake has been located for a very long time. A village in which persons lived when she visited Shenzhen, and which also then responds to the final question about how have migrant workers been responding to these changes, and the changes as in the Greater Bay Area, especially with the aggressive efforts to integrate Hong Kong with mainland China that we now see to create large urban complex region that is built around Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, with places like Zhuhai and Xiamen sort of playing small side roles in the side. It's the capital has always moved in this particular area. Money from Guangzhou has moved to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong has moved into Shenzhen. So the capital networks are complex and deep and connect all these cities through a variety of community linkages and clan networks. But the people who now populate these places, how have they been responding to it, and how has the state been responding to the kind of phenomena that Juan has been pointing out, which is the transformation of the villages? Some space being needed for this quote-unquote modernization project as the city moves from being a manufacturing city to a service and technology hub. So if I can ask Marianne to sort of finish by telling us a little bit about the transformations that's been taking place in the villages and where she sees the future of that transformation going. And unless there are any final questions, we'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that there's a lot that's happening right now, and COVID-19 has really shifted how the villages operate and how prosperous they are. In part because they were shut down for so long, but also because once villagers returned to their home villages, very often they were kept there and not allowed to come back. Deindustrialization, top-down deindustrialization of the former SAZ, of the SEZ, which would have been Luohu, Futian, and Nanshan, began in 2005. For top-down deindustrialization of the outer districts began in 2010. So at this point, especially in a place like Baishuzhou, many of the occupants of the village were not actually rural. They were, because Baishuzhou, by the time we were evicted in 2019, Baishuzhou was per unit one of the most expensive sites in the city. It was just cheap because you could get a small space, but it wasn't cheap per unit. And there were two primary types of people living in Baishuzhou. There were families with school-age children, and there were college graduates from second and third tier cities who wanted to be in the city and close to work, but could not afford rentals in the more formal areas. The reason there were families living in Baishuzhou is because Nanshan district is one of the most upper middle class districts in the city. And Shenzhen's public schooling is based on legal registered population. And what that means is that in more upscale neighborhoods, families many will send their children to an international school. When they do that, that frees up a school placement. And so Nanshan, having such a rich legal population, is home to many, many, many international schools. And what that means is Nanshan district has the highest number of free public school places in the city for people without legal registration in Shenzhen. So that Baishuzhou, you didn't have what you would think of as a typical migrant worker. Instead, by and large, these were established families who were high enough in their own working conditions that they could afford to spend about $3,000 to $4,000 per month for a 2-bedroom, 40 square meter apartment in Baishuzhou, and thereby secure a school placement for their children because of the way that the legal population was using international schools. And then because Overseas Chinese Town and the new high-tech part were bringing in a lot of their low-level workers were coming in from were college graduates from second and third tier cities. They were also living in the village. We rented, for example, a 12 square meter space. And by the time we were evicted with water and electricity, we were spending $1,500 a month, which is over, it's like 120, 125 yuan per square meter, which is really high. But again, Baishuzhou is one of the few places in the area where you could rent 12 square meters, right? Rather than having to rent 50 or 100. So what the deindustrialization has meant is that most of the villages within the former SEZ footprint are actually second and third tier city college graduates and families who are taking advantage of educational opportunities. In the outer districts, again, it depends where you are, because with the opening of the number 11 high-speed railway, housing in Bao'an is now more expensive than housing in parts of Luohu, because Luohu doesn't have the same access to the subway. What you see happening there is many of the low-tech factories have left Bao'an in these areas, started leaving 10 years ago, but most had been moved out by 5 years ago. And so in Bao'an, again, in the villages, you see that they're empty, and there are empty spaces in these villages. And this has become especially clear with COVID. For the first time since I've been in Shenzhen, I've seen housing in Baishuzhou. There was a point where I was seeing the same place being offered up for rent for 6 months. It was like these apartments used to go in like 3 days or something. But with COVID, with the close down of shops and whatnot, it's been really hard. So in terms of where are low-level migrant workers going, they are in Dongguan and Huizhou, where Shenzhen is seeing in its urban villages, like for example, in Bantian. In Bantian, many of the workers are what are known as pugong. They're ordinary workers in Foxconn and Huawei. And to be an ordinary worker there, you've got at least a high school education, and it's a lot of families living there. And so that what we think of as a migrant worker, we really have to change our idea and think more of terms of immigration in the United States, where it's not only rural to urban migration, but also urban to urban migration and post-university migration to the city, where you've got people, like one of the major groups of people coming into Shenzhen are from Wuhan. Wuhan has a lot of colleges, it's got a lot of designers, it's got a lot of architects, these kinds of people, but they're not at the top of the thing. So you have places where, like in architectural firms in overseas Chinese, where if you're not just, you come in, maybe you're only making 5,000 a month in a lot of these places still. If you come in from a second or third tier city, and you're coming in to do basic level rendering or something like that, right? Working on they're not making a lot of money, but housing prices continue to skyrocket. So one of the major ways that the Greater Bay Area has changed this is housing in the western side of the city. So this is Nanshan, Shekao, and Bao'an. It's out of control. Bao'an, for example, is now 60 to 70,000 per square meter to buy. Bao'an, right? If you're near the subway. So it's really reshaped housing market, but also there was a moratorium put on demolishing villages until 2025. However, many of those villages are being upgraded to be brought into compliance with a lot of regulations. However, it's really, most of the villages, Shajing, for example, which used to be a real center of low-end manufacturing, is demolishing a lot of its villages to put up new housing high-rises next to the subway as part of access to the Qianghai area, because it's all linked through freeways and subway lines. And so this is one of the things we're seeing is the villages themselves, even when they're not being formally gentrified, the housing prices in Shenzhen even are going up so high. And then with the way COVID restructured coming into an access to the cities and the villages. So for example, there was like a year, so we started closing down, they started closing down the villages over about a year ago. And a lot of the low-end small shops closed because they didn't have the same numbers of people coming in to go shopping. They didn't have the same numbers of people who were living there. This year it's different because last year there was, after people went home for Chinese New Year because there were real limits on who could come back to the city. So that places like Bantian, they couldn't find workers. You know, there weren't enough people, there weren't enough workers in a lot of these areas. This year, Shenzhen's not allowing workers to leave, right? So that across, it's not only in terms of prevention of COVID prevention and whatnot, but also key industries, they're not letting workers leave. And I don't know if that's because last year, you know, there were jobs that used to be like 20, 24 an hour, that in last year in April and May, they were getting 36 to 40 an hour. They could ask because there were so few workers in the city relative to the amount of jobs that needed to be filled. So I would say that in terms of who's living in the villages, there's salaries are all higher than they used to be. The real low-level single workers that we're used to thinking of, they're in Dongguan and Huizhou where the factories are. And higher end, like in Foxconn, in Huawei, in these upper end industries like printing, for example, Shenzhen is really high in printing, where you need higher levels of education. These are the new kinds of workers that are living in these areas. Or, as I was saying, families who want their children to get access to public schools. And so they tend to be, and those families tend to be in the richer areas because that's where the legal kids are in international schools, so their space is freed up. Yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. That's a very rich description of the transformations that are taking place, and especially the transformation that's happened over the last year and the response there is. So with that, I think it's quite clear that as Mark has been sort of insisting right from the beginning, that there are really no neat, clear boxes into which we can categorize the urbanization processes in these two very large countries. They each have very distinctive characteristics, and they provide much food for thought and much thinking about the nature of urbanization, which might be quite different from the nature of urbanization that has taken place in currently urbanized countries. At least the processes might be much more complicated than one sort of has seen from previous modeling structures in that area. So hoping that this rich discussion will have enabled all of you to start thinking about doing work on urbanization in India and China, which is the thrust of this particular session, to try and provoke young scholars to try and pick up these issues and run with them. And as you can see, one of the side benefits of doing that is you'd be able to repair mobile phones of your counterparts, as Solly has promised you to help you do. So with those words, thank you so much for being with us. If any of the panelists would wish to make any final statements at this point in time, I know it's very late in Hong Kong, so unless there are any pressing statements that any of them would make, we can close at this point in time. Mark, Solly, Juan, would you like anything, any final closing remarks that you might want to make before one closes?
I've been very, I guess, economical in my remarks, and I just wanted to just one more last on this notion of the the city as a palimpsest, that the institutions and social practices are kind of layered upon each other, as Sally was mentioning in the discussion of Prasad Shetty's work. And to connect with a film genre, I'm thinking of Poltergeist. It's not really a genre, but an actual film where you got this California suburb emerging over what turns out to be a grave site, and the ghosts are creating a lot of trouble. But we can think of this in institutional terms too, where they're not necessarily ghosts doing damage, but they're there and they're not going away. Thanks.
Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Thank you all very much, and for staying up so late and also waking up so early, both and extremely.
It's all about, we're all about transnational exchange here. So, but it's a pleasure to be seeing everyone again, and I would like to thank also all of the participants and audience for indulging our presentations. And if anyone obviously have any questions for me or for any of the panelists, you feel free to just reach us at our institutional emails. I'm in Hong Kong. My heart will always be in Hong Kong, even though I may be physically going elsewhere in a few months. But so I will continue even after I go, I would say, back to North America. I would definitely continue connecting with all of my friends, both here in the academic community, but also in the cities. So thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the ICS team for a wonderfully glitch-free experience. Thank you so much for the environment that ICS provides, where I'm an honorary fellow, and the wonderful team at IIT Madras at Chennai, who's been, and the two of them have been working together in creating this conference. Tomorrow's sessions, Rija, I understand, begin at 11 o'clock. Is that correct?
Yes, Partha.
Yes. So, and those of you who wish to sort of continue this experience and learning more about China, please feel free to log in to various emails tomorrow at 11 a.m. And it'll be the same link on which you have been on the system. Thank you so much.